In its 60-year history, the Bundesliga has had its fair share of scandals that has rocked the entire league. So it's time to look back at each major scandal that the league has endured in its 60-year history. And there's three major ones. Obviously, there are individual scandals that have affected clubs like Bayer Leverkusen and Christoph Daum taking cocaine, for example, Uli Hoeneß getting found out for tax avoidance with Bayern Munich, but this is a league-wide video.
So scandalous. So scandalous.
So the first scandal to hit the league was in its second ever season, and it had several knock-on effects which still impact the Bundesliga today. Now, for the context of this scandal in particular, when the Bundesliga was founded in 1963, it was not a fully professional league. The players got paid, but they did not get paid enough to make it a full-time job. So plenty of workers worked other jobs. For example, in the Ruhr, at Schalke or Bochum, for example, they worked in the mines. While, for example, Franz Beckenbauer did an internship at an insurance company by the name of Allianz. While there was also an initial salary cap included, so it would stop one team racing ahead of all the others. So it kind of like leveled the playing field as much as it possibly could. However, clubs would obviously work to find a way around this, whether that be when players signed a contract, they would be paid large upfront fees, or money would be handed to them behind the back in addition to the set wage they would earn. And so, for example, like one player, this is a hypothetical situation, would earn a certain amount of marks per month. I think it was set at something like 1,200, and he would be given 3,000 marks behind the back each month, which then meant he actually wouldn't have needed the second job, but he would be given one by the club just for bookkeeping's sake, for example. And most clubs did this. Obviously, certain clubs who were a lot more wealthier were able, or from wealthy areas like Cologne, for example, in the early stages of the Bundesliga. So Cologne, Kaiserslautern wasn't wealthy, but so for example, Kaiserslautern kind of circumvented the salary cap because they said they were paying a certain fee, and then they said they were paying everyone else the same amount of money. But the first team to get caught for doing this was Hertha Berlin. And how they were caught was issues within the club's finances were spotted when the DFB audited their finance. So most clubs could kind of get away with paying their players behind the backs. But Hertha needed to spend even more money to convince people to come and play in Berlin, because obviously back then Berlin was more or less an island. In fact, it was in the middle of East Germany, and the political and socio-economic issues meant players would need severely convincing, as in paid a lot of money to then moving to Berlin. And so despite several clubs were punished and caught eventually, but for Hertha it was about setting an example. And so their punishment was relegation to the second division, which at that time it was regionalised, so they were in the Regional Liga Berlin. Now, because the only Berlin side was relegated, from a political standpoint, the DFB wanted another Berlin side in the Bundesliga. So they asked around the other clubs, Tennis Borussia Berlin and Spandauer Berlin as well, but they both declined because Tennis Borussia Berlin didn't decline, but they had missed out on promotion. So it would look a bit unfair to in the mini league. There were two teams that had already been promoted, and you forced Tennis Borussia Berlin into the first division. But the one side that did accept the invite was, after these two teams, was the team that finished third in the regional second division, and that was Tasmania Berlin. They would spend one season in the Bundesliga, and they would go on to be the worst team to have ever played in the Bundesliga, going on a losing run, which is still their record to this day, but what was recently, as in 2020-21, nearly beaten by Schalke. Speaking of Schalke, both Schalke and Karlsruhe were set to be relegated at the end of that season, but following Hertha's automatic relegation, or forced relegation, they complained. And because they complained, they would actually end up maintaining their place in the first division, and the way around this was they had to ultimately expand the Bundesliga from 16 to 18 teams. The teams that they needed to accommodate were Bayern Munich and Borussia Mönchengladbach.
So scandalous.
The next scandal was a lot bigger, and I mean much bigger, and rocked the whole league only 6 years after payment scandal. So to set the scene, Kickers Offenbach president Horst Gregorio Canales hosted a birthday party to celebrate his 50th birthday. And it was a real who's who of German football at the time, with the likes of Helmut Schön, the head coach of the German national team there, journalists, whatever. But recently, Canales' Offenbach had been relegated from the Bundesliga. And so the president had an ace up his sleeve to try and reverse this decision. And so during his birthday party, he would play a tape recording of conversations between himself and a host of players, including 2 Hertha Berlin players, and Cologne goalkeeper Manfred Manglitz, who did play for the German national team too. Now, what was it about these recordings that was such a big deal? Well, the tape recordings would be about the players offering their services as well as threatening to fix matches. Whether that be demanding a fee to avoid them playing bad against Offenbach's relegation rivals, or they throw the game in favour of Offenbach. That was the conversations with Canales. It wasn't just about Offenbach, it was this is what they would do. Initially, when people at this party heard these rules, like players, they said there's nothing wrong with this. Like there's nothing wrong with players receiving bonuses for wins or losses or whatever. Now, this annoyed Canales, and so he began to investigate the potential fixing further, and found that most teams involved were their fellow relegation candidates, namely Rot-Weiss Oberhausen and Arminia Bielefeld. However, Offenbach and Canales weren't completely clean. Canales had actually participated when he played Manglitz ahead of a Cologne game against fellow strugglers Rot-Weiss Essen, which Cologne won 3-2. This was because Manglitz basically blackmailed him and said, "I'll play badly if you don't pay me money." And ahead of the final game of the season, Manglitz was doing this again, and he said to Canales, if you pay me, I will play badly against you, and if you win this game, you survive and stay in the Bundesliga. And Canales had had enough. So because no one was believing him, he visited Manglitz's teammate at Cologne and future national team player, Wolfgang Overath, allegedly with his son, because it would have made what he was about to say more believable. And Canales told Overath what was going on and basically said, I could only trust my son now. And so as a result, Manglitz was dropped ahead of the final game of the season against Offenbach. And Offenbach would lose 4-2, meaning they would be relegated. Some of the other games that were infected included Schalke versus Arminia Bielefeld, which Bielefeld won 1-0, which is important because obviously Schalke at this point are a very big and important player in the Bundesliga. Cologne versus Essen, as we said, Cologne versus Oberhausen, Duisburg versus Arminia Bielefeld, Bielefeld versus Stuttgart, and Hertha Berlin versus Bielefeld. And so, what was Canales' motive for all of this? His motive was that revealing the match fixing would mean Offenbach would then stay in the league and Bielefeld would be relegated in their place. However, this backfired. In the initial investigation, Canales would be given a life ban for not only for pretending to accept the bribes of the players over the phone, and also the fact he did actively participate in the bribery because he paid Manglitz, who was also given a lifetime ban. And Offenbach's relegation was not overturned and they were sent back down, while Essen were inadvertently affected by this but managed to recover. Now, after this decision to not allow or to not save Offenbach, for example, Canales then did some admittedly very good investigative journalism to gather more and more information about the whole match-fixing scandal. And like a rabbit hole, he would find out that 2/3 of the league had been involved in the scandal, and over 50 players from 7 clubs would be suspended for some reason or another because of what Canales had found. Bielefeld would be punished, but next season, when they would be automatically relegated before the season even began, they would end up going down with Borussia Dortmund. While a host of players would receive lifetime bans as well as fines, but those bans would be reduced, such as Klaus Fischer, who was reduced to 1 year, or they would be pardoned years later. Now, what's interesting here is Klaus Fischer is quite a major player in the context of German football, because his decision to participate in this match fixing, it took away 1 Bundesliga season and 1 year and 5 years of his international career. Fischer is the 3rd highest goal scorer in the history of the Bundesliga. He has 268 goals. He could have potentially played even longer, or he could have scored even more goals. And then in the national team, because he was basically kind of going neck and neck with Gerd Müller at this point, his ban from the national team meant Gerd Müller was able to establish himself as the main striker for the national team. And as a result, Fischer also missed out on the 1974 World Cup, which Germany won. And the closest he came was in 1982, when West Germany won or finished runners-up in the Bundesliga in the World Cup. It's also worth noting that Fischer did actually win ARD Goal of the Century for the 20th century for his bicycle kick. But yeah, so like Fischer was the major player that was found to be at fault for this match fixing. And as a result, and at the end of all this, the DFB ended up removing the salary cap, which had been in place for nearly 6 years at this point. So 2 scandals resulted to the salary cap, because obviously if you remove the salary cap, then these players are less likely to accept behind the back money or aim to fix matches in their favour.
So scandalous.
And then the final scandal is again related to match fixing to a degree, and this happened in 2005. And this wasn't as much as focused on the Bundesliga, but obviously it's still important. So obviously Germany in 2006 were going to host the World Cup. Or what worse a time for this to happen, when in 2005, 18 months before the World Cup, there was a betting scandal surrounding referee Robert Heuser. Now what Heuser would do is he would use his power of being a ref to manipulate the outcome of games to satisfy bets that had been made on them. Most of the leagues were the lower leagues, so the Zweite Bundesliga, as low as the Regional Liga, as well as the first round of the DFB Pokal. Why? Because these are not as heavily monitored, and you can get away with doing, or you could back then get away with making questionable decisions, because not as many games were being monitored by people like regulatory boards. So the scandal began right at the beginning in early 2005, when a group of refs, including future Bundesliga refs Manuel Graf and Felix Zweier, approached the DFB about Heuser's actions. So what he had been doing was linked to a betting gang in Berlin, which had links to the Croatian mafia. So, for example, the Croatian mafia would put a bet on a game. They would say to Heuser, you get this fee if this works out for us, and that's what Heuser would do. So that's like a dodgy penalty, a non-call for something, whatever. And instead of going, I never did this, he confessed quite soon afterwards. He confessed his links to the scandal, and he said the accusations made against me in public are essentially true. So he basically admitted to it. And he would ultimately be banned for life and would also serve a short prison sentence, but not without working with the authorities to put to an end to the scandal. And so other refs would be punished, and that's such as Dominic Marks, who Heuser had mentioned when he was questioned, and he would be arrested and spend time in prison. But most notably would be Zweier, who is now a Bundesliga ref. So Zweier accepted €300 from Heuser when he was working alongside him as an assistant. And he was also punished and banned for 6 months as he failed to report his colleagues' actions. And so some of the matches that were affected were like Paderborn's 4-2 win against Hamburg in the DFB Pokal. Heuser is said to have received around €50,000 from the success of the bet, which was 100,000 bet on Paderborn to win. At this point, obviously, Hamburg were a Bundesliga side, while Paderborn were the underdog. And so the odds were obviously heavily against Paderborn, to win. And so like Heuser sent off a Hamburg player, for example. And so with games that had been affected, you know, there were calls for them to be replayed. But the issue with this game is it happened in the first round of the DFB Pokal, which happens in August. And this was in January. So you could not go back and fix the issue, because by that point Paderborn had been knocked out of the Pokal against Freiburg. So as a result, Hamburg would be compensated €500,000, and they would also get the money from a national team game that would be played at the Volksparkstadion. A second Bundesliga game between LR Aalen and Wacker Burghausen was replayed, as Heuser had awarded a questionable penalty in the game, while Unterhaching versus Saarbrücken was supposed to be fixed after Heuser gave away a penalty, a questionable penalty again, but it failed as the awarded penalty was missed. While Dominic Marx is said to have received €6,000 for manipulating a game involving Hertha Berlin's amateurs. And it's also worth noting that there were a couple of players indicted in this as well, Hertha Berlin players at the time as well, who had links to the betting bar in Berlin that these issues were coming out of. Ultimately, the scandal caused wholesale changes to how refereeing operates. In Germany, it included questioning of professionalism of the role, because all these refs are not full-time refs. I mean, Svea works in property. Dr. Felix Brick, who is a former ref, was a doctor. Dennis Eiterking works as a businessman. You understand in a way why these people started to take these sorts of money, because of, you know, it would help. And then there was just a general betting ban placed on the players, clubs and the refs. So Heuser would go to prison for 3 years and will be released in 2008. He did actually return to football, but as a technical director for the Berlin-based sides Berliner AK07 and Victoria Berlin, and he now works as a sales manager for an e-commerce company. And so the only person really left from this scandal is Felix Svea. And he's obviously gone on to ref in the Europa League final, and he's listed in the elite category of refs in Europe, obviously because of his links to this, as well as just his horrible refereeing decisions. There are obviously question marks about his continued involvement in being a ref in these situations. So those are the three major scandals that have rocked the Bundesliga in its 60-year history, or just over 60 years. And I think it will be interesting to see whether another scandal could potentially hit the whole league at one point or another. Obviously, as I said at the beginning, there's plenty of singular club scandals, but ones that really rocks the whole league and makes a change that is felt for years to come.